there's an introduction of a carbon tax in Denmark. Most healthcare industry companies in Denmark are international companies. So it's going to influence the way they compete in a global market. But then there's it begs the eternal question, are we introducing an obstacle for Danish companies that will make them more likely to succeed in the future in the international markets? Or are we actually inhibiting growth? And the interesting thing about a carbon tax is that if you're carbon efficient and if you're optimizing for higher degrees of carbon efficiency, you're probably also going to optimize for profitability at the same time.
Hello, Joachim from Green Innovation Group here with another episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. In this episode, I'm talking with Frederik, our CEO in Green Innovation Group, about the newly proposed Danish carbon tax and what carbon taxes in general means for the healthcare industry and how it affects your business. If you want to listen to more episodes, please subscribe to Spotify or Apple, or check us out at greeninnovationgroup.com. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast, Frederik.
Thank you, Joachim. It's good to be back.
It is good to have you. And today we're going to talk about carbon taxes and what are the implications for the healthcare industry. The reason that we're talking about that is that the Danish government has proposed a carbon tax for Denmark. And we're not going to dive too much into the specifics, but more talk about the mechanisms. But briefly, what is the proposal from the Danish government?
First of all, let's celebrate that a carbon tax is actually being proposed right now.
That's a very good thing.
That's a big. It's a milestone. It really is a milestone. And then after that, we can go into critique mode and say what's good and bad about it. But I think that it's extremely positive that something is actually happening. That someone has the courage to actually politically go in and drive this agenda. So I think that calls for celebration. Then on the critique side of things, there's a lot of fingers to be pointed. The reason why this happens is that the Danish government, upon election, went out and said we need to reduce the national emissions from Denmark by 70% compared to 1990 levels. That's a significant emission reduction. And since then, in all honesty, we have seen a whole lot of nothing. And everyone who knows something about emissions reductions have been pointing towards a carbon tax as the most efficient driver for carbon emission reductions. And that's simply because if you emit carbon into the atmosphere or other harmful greenhouse gases, you are going to have to pay for it as a company.
Yeah. And as a rule of thumb, luxury goods aside, when things get more expensive, there will be less of them.
Yes. So increasing the cost is supposedly going to decrease demand and also incentivize innovation and doing things in new ways or greener ways. So that's why it's relevant. We have a single government, single party government in Denmark right now, the Social Democrats, and they've proposed this carbon tax at €100 per ton emitted, which is now we get to the critiquing part. Not as high as it's recommended by economic experts. They most advocate a €200 tax per ton. So €100 is a lot better than nothing, but it's only half of what's actually recommended. So that's one side of the critique that I think we should take quite seriously. That we have introduced a tax, but is it really the carbon tax we need, or is it simply a carbon tax? But if we're going to leave that in the parking lot, so to speak, then the second part is that the Danish government has also proposed a whole range of discounts for certain companies that do have very emission-intensive businesses and very low employment rates, but who are going to get a massive discount on the carbon tax, and I mean that's quite problematic. But when we're looking at a healthcare context, which we are, this is the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. After all,
it's what we do.
So, what are the implications for the healthcare industry? Well, overall, there's an introduction of a carbon tax in Denmark. Most healthcare industry companies in Denmark are international companies, so it's going to influence the way they compete in a global market. That's one side of it. But then there's it begs the eternal question: are we introducing an obstacle for Danish companies that will make them more likely to succeed in the future in the international markets, or are we actually inhibiting growth in the area? And time will tell, but traditionally speaking, it has been an advantage that we have had higher environmental requirements for Danish companies. When legislation on an international level starts catching up, the Danish companies are already prepared for it.
And I think this is also, it's definitely another big milestone in the sustainable healthcare megatrend, where we have seen more and more healthcare organizations, hospital chains, etc., like the Danish regions or the NHS, National Healthcare System in UK, are setting climate goals, working towards not emitting any carbon, often, thankfully, also being more circular. And a carbon tax is another big part of that, and something you can't ignore. And now it's for Denmark. Denmark is a very small country. We are 6 million people. But just as with the climate goals and strategies set by some healthcare systems, we have every reason to believe that in the future that will be all healthcare systems. And the same for carbon taxes. Yes. Whether it will be global or just individually organized by nations, who knows? But it's coming.
We can hope that it's going to be a little bit like a sales tax, right? That in some countries it's going to be 12%, and others 25% for carbon taxes. Since it's something that is influencing all of us, we can hope that we're going to get a universal carbon tax that is justly priced in a way where it's going to be a vehicle for more equality and more inclusion and more social mobility, whereas the system we have right now, where it's actually good business to pollute, is simply just not sustainable.
Why is it actually important, Frederik, that the healthcare industry becomes sustainable and stops emitting carbon?
If we do the entire helicopter perspective, we're looking at rising temperatures at a global level. The key contributing reason for that is a higher concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The healthcare sector and the healthcare industry is responsible for somewhere between 4 and 8% of all of those greenhouse gases, depending on which source you're citing and where you sort of fence the industry.
Wealthier countries spend a higher percentage of their resources on healthcare. They'll be at the higher end. Developing countries will be at the lower.
Yeah, but a common denominator is that the healthcare sector is growing, and the demand for healthcare services is growing, and the life expectancy of all populations is also going up. So all of these things combined tells us that the need for green healthcare services and green treatments is extremely crucial. We will have no green transition without the healthcare sector taking part in it.
I think that's a very good stopping point. We will have no green transition without the healthcare sector going green. You said that it's a big problem now, but it's also a problem that's getting worse because the population is aging and we are going to be spending more resources on healthcare, especially from the developing countries. So what does this mean, that if I'm a pharma company or a medtech company, that if I'm in Denmark, there's already a carbon tax on the very near horizon. Most companies are not in Denmark, but they can probably expect a carbon tax at some point. How does this change the business operations?
The way you should look at it is you should look at the writing on the wall. And now there's actually no writing on this wall, but
I don't think we're allowed to write on this.
The main idea is that if what we're seeing is a carbon tax will be introduced, green procurement policies in the public sector are going to be introduced, then it's probably also going to spill over to private hospitals. So there's an increasing demand for transparency, for life cycle assessment of different products, and for emission estimates in order to actually collect the taxes and account for the taxes. So if you want to future-proof a pharma company or a medtech company, you will need to put your own house in order. And what most of our clients and other adjacent companies are doing is it's very labor-intensive to figure out the actual emissions of all of your activities and all of your services in the business. So what's happening mostly is that you're looking at your dollar spend. And then you're saying, we're spending $1 billion on external solution providers that provide us with materials, services, and then we're just multiplying that with a factor to guesstimate our carbon footprint. And I mean, it's great that that's being done. Then you have something that you can start improving on. I mean, you're making some estimations, which is infinitely better than not making estimations. But when we're advising our clients in the pharma and medtech industry, we're telling them, look, if 40% of all of your revenue is generated from public actors, and these public actors are introducing green demands in their procurement policies in a country that is introducing a carbon tax, all your future development projects need to take this future reality into contention when they're figuring out which idea to go with and which strategy to run with.
And it's actually all across the board, all the way from the clinical research through production out to the commercial department and the sales guy in the car who's going out and trying.
Yes, it's a holistic problem that calls for holistic solutions, and it also brings us into this another very important megatrend is the rise of the preventive healthcare. So a student, when I was giving a lecture the other day at the University of Southern Denmark, and a student asked me, so what do you mean by preventive healthcare? And I was like, you bugger, did you really ask me that? But you know, it's really constructive to think of it as pre and post diagnosis. So everything we do pre-diagnosis, that will be you going to your general practitioner for a normal checkup at the doctor. It will be me taking a COVID test at home. It will be me calling a psychologist because I'm not feeling great, but I'm not feeling literally depressed.
Nudging towards more movement or diet through various mechanisms.
Yeah, the works will sort of go into that preventive healthcare box. It will also be something like sexual education in the school. It's a very broad field, right? Then the moment you have the diagnosis, there's actually still a preventive care element in it. So say that a patient has been diagnosed with, or it's been concluded that the person is obese, then measures of prevention to prevent some of the lifestyle diseases that could follow, some of the chronic diseases that could come, diabetes, or an incident of a stroke or a heart attack. You know, all of these things where you can start deploying different tools from the preventive healthcare toolbox, like saying you need to eat more plants rather than butter and caramels, or you need to exercise more. You know, all of these sort of nudging the behavior and making an effort that prevents the patient from going into the very severe medical conditions. And
from a sustainability angle,
I was just about to go there. It's important because the most sustainable patient, I said that at the lecture as well. I was asking the question like, who is the most sustainable patient in the world? And one of the students goes like, a dead one.
Well, you're not entirely wrong.
I'm like, I was about to say the one that never enters the hospital, but you know, let's roll with death for a while, and then I really love giving these lectures. It's a lot of fun, and you get kind of that sort of youthful perspective that I'm not that old, but you know, it's still really inspiring to get it. So the most, if we're looking besides the death patient, the most sustainable patient is the one that never goes into the hospital, right? And that's why an investment in prevention in a carbon budget sense is a really good investment.
And I think that's a lot of the things that why our carbon tax has so much impact potential, and why it's a game changer, is that it forces you to put a number on. When we are out working with our clients, whether it's in innovation or procurement or production part, so many times most places now, we're at a place where there is an awareness of that sustainability is important. Most people in the healthcare industry are very driven, and I mean, if they just wanted to make money, they would have went somewhere else. They also make a lot of money in industry, but in the industry. But if that was the only thing, they would have gone somewhere else. So the awareness is there. The goals have been set from top management, but then there's a very, very big execution gap, and into how do we actually get this moving into practice? And a very big thing in that is that large organizations, large companies, at the end of the day, they're driven by the people, yes, but there's also a lot of spreadsheets or software equivalents where you will have check numbers that are deciding whether something is good or bad on calculating the specific business case, whether it's on a treatment level, a clinical trial, or production. And in most cases, carbon emissions says 0 in there at the moment. Material use says 0. So I mean, of course, there'll be a price for buying some copper, but the fact that we are depleting it and the environmental cost is put at 0. And that's one of the things that we're hearing a lot from our clients, is that if I could just get something in there, anything, so that it's not 0 in the spreadsheet, because that changes the whole business case. And the crazy thing is that I mean, sometimes we're hired to find new business cases, sustainable business cases, and calculate them. And a lot of times you can calculate and make really good business cases without a carbon tax.
Yeah.
So that really says something, that if it's already good business to be sustainable, introducing a carbon tax makes it even more sustainable. Yeah. And in terms of future-proofing, there will be a lot of ways we're doing things, activities, products that stop being good business.
Yeah,
when you introduce the carbon tax. And I think especially the more knowledge you have put into your product, whether it's a drug or medtech, and into your production, and hopefully IP protected it as well, and so on, the more interesting the carbon tax is for you. Because if you're just competing on price, that's usually very poorly linked to carbon emissions. And we're seeing that a lot of Western companies are finding a tougher and tougher time when it's just price competition, competing with Asian incumbents. So if I were any of those Western companies, I would really welcome a carbon tax, because it gives a new angle of competition where you would usually be much better suited. Yeah,
and it's like, welcome, there's a whole new playing field where you can beat the other organizations that are miles behind. And definitely you should welcome that change and that recent development with open arms. Because I mean, one thing that has really shocked me is how a lot of very large organizations are organized in terms of how they organize and structure the data that they have about the products that they're selling. That a lot of companies don't necessarily have a centrally structured and organized database that indexes everything they know about themselves. And I think in today's day and age, just having that insight is a tremendous lever for business opportunities and for running your business more effectively. And the interesting thing about a carbon tax is that if you're carbon efficient and if you're optimizing for higher degrees of carbon efficiency, you're probably also going to optimize for profitability at the same time. That's kind of it. If you're saving carbon, you're probably spending less. And
in a lot of cases, definitely, and also just downright at the end of it. I mean, it's early days, but we are seeing this in tenders from public procurement from healthcare systems that healthcare, medtech companies, pharma companies are losing tenders because of sustainability issues.
And also just outside of the healthcare sector, Volvo, the car manufacturer from Sweden, have actually introduced in their innovation department that all business cases should take in mind €100 CO2 tax or carbon tax. So,
yeah, that's a whole nother thing that that can definitely be a tool to future-proof yourself. One way of doing it is that start introducing an internal carbon tax. And the crazy thing is that now we're saying this is like, oh, it's new. There's a carbon tax coming. There weren't a carbon tax before. Well, it's not actually that it were free emitting carbon before. It was just not organized as a national tax. So it actually has a cost already, but that cost is not. It just mostly seen at a company level. So if you're sitting at I'm a senior vice president for production or for device development or something else. Even now where emitting a ton of CO2 is not free, also outside of Denmark, but that doesn't figure in the spreadsheet. And a good way of starting to make it figure in the spreadsheet as a minimum would say, okay, well, I mean, if there's a cost, put it in there, but also if we know that there's €100, and if there's €100, there's definitely a €200 tax coming, let's start to calculate for that future, because what we're seeing, I mean, there's been a build-up and political pressure in Denmark, but if you haven't been following pretty closely, it can seem like it happened overnight. And what we can see is that legislation...
I was listening to we're recording this on a Thursday, and it was released yesterday. This episode is going to be released on Monday. But when I was listening to the news on the radio Thursday morning, there was no mention of the carbon tax, even though this is like the number one tool in the toolbox that's being deployed by the government. And you know, for me, this was like, I was so excited listening to, I was going to listen to the news, right? And there was nothing in there. And I listened to the news on the day it was released as well, and there was nothing in there. Then I actually had to go and find a radio show that did sort of a feature specifically on that I had to go and find myself. So it's also mind-boggling, like how little attention this massive piece of news has had. And I think that's also because of that little caveat that we talked about in the beginning, that the ones that are polluting the most are getting a massive discount on the tax. So the ones that are responsible for 40% of the emissions in Denmark are getting a massive discount. So arguably, there's
a lot of room for improvement.
Exactly, and maybe that's why people are not celebrating. But I feel like we need to celebrate a little bit.
The key thing here is that if you're sitting, especially as a private company, a pharma company, medtech company, legislation change can happen overnight. Carbon tax introduction can happen overnight. It probably will at some point. Especially if you're rooted in a Western country. So you might as well start to prepare now, because carbon tax combined with sustainable procurement from the healthcare systems does mean that all else being equal, the more sustainable product will win. I mean, of course, we're always working within a frame of safety and efficiency for the patient, and cost of treatment to some degree as well. But the more sustainable product will win, all else being equal. You will, of course, still have like a niche cancer treatment where there are very few alternatives and only a couple of suppliers, that might not be the case. But most drugs, most treatments, it's a relatively competitive playing field with multiple vendors.
Yeah, we know the change is going to come. Yeah. What's uncertain is when. Yeah. And therefore you might as well start improving for and optimizing for a future where costs are actually reflected in true costs and where it actually pays to be green.
What are some potential projects and initiatives that you could do as a pharma medtech company to start preparing for this? And as we said, it's actually throughout your whole value chain. But two places I would definitely start is one would be to start educating my sales force and building the basic literacy so that they have a fighting chance in the tenders of when they're selling, whether it's to general practitioners or healthcare systems and other things. As of today, they need to have a basic understanding on the carbon emissions.
That literacy. Yeah. There's no doubt about it. And then a different side of it is figure out what the footprint actually is. Yeah. Start running these assessments so you can go to the market with your product and say the life cycle assessment, the combined CO2 footprint of this product and service that we are selling is this, and it's calculated through this methodology. I don't think it's feasible that the tenders are going to be decisive on purchasing the least emitting product. I think at first they're going to ask for transparency and estimates, and then they can figure, because they're not going to do it by the same method. So it'll be comparing oranges and car wheels, and that's going to be a problem. But that they have attempted to run an assessment will be a qualifier, a disqualifier.
Then I would also say another area where we're working a lot with our clients is clinical development and clinical research, which is a key area to start in. And you might say, okay,
it's 10 years to market.
And the two key things here are, one, clinical research in itself is quite polluting, especially as you get towards phase 3. But the second is that essentially creates the lock-in effects that will determine how you can produce and how the actual treatment will be. So once you have gotten something through the FDA, for instance, it's very, very hard to change. And that ends up locking that in for decades. I mean, it's not like you can change anything, but it's very difficult. And right now it's simply not a design factor. So something small like does it have to be cool at minus 70 degrees or minus 65 degrees? That's once you scale that up to treatment for millions of people, it's a massive carbon difference, and people err on the safe side just because. Something like in the treatment, does it say that I should go to a general practitioner with my doctor if I'm feeling something is off or sick, or does it say that I should go every 6 months if it's a long-term or chronic disease? I mean, going if you feel something is wrong, or going if you every 6 months, massive carbon difference. And of course, I mean, the treatments, the drugs should still be safe and effective, but there are so many things where we're doing them just because.
Yeah, and I mean, what is the role of telemedicine? What is the role of prevention in there? You know, there's so many levers to pull and opportunities to be had for anyone in this market. So yeah.
So it's exciting times. The wave is definitely there. If you are in pharma or medtech or healthcare services, you need to be working on this.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. Really enjoyed these talks.
Me too.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to listen to more episodes, subscribe at Spotify or Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and also check out our books and white papers on greeninnovationgroup.com. Have a great day.